Welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Gentleman's Agreement, Confucian Virtue Ethics. As you might have noticed in this series and the previous series on Indian philosophy, we've mostly been avoiding the temptation to draw parallels between these classical traditions and ancient Greek philosophy. Not that doing so would be illegitimate or unilluminating. It's more that we don't want to presume any background knowledge of Greek thought, and more importantly, don't want to suggest that the Indian and Chinese material is legitimated as philosophy only by managing to resemble what we find in European antiquity. In this episode, though, we're going to depart from that practice, because we want to look at an approach to Confucian ethics that is inspired by its evident similarity to what we find in Aristotle. This approach identifies the Confucian account as an example of what is nowadays called virtue ethics. It's a school of thought within moral theory that has emerged over the last half-century or so, proposed and defended by such figures as Elizabeth Anscombe, Philippa Foot, Rosalind Hursthouse, and Alistair MacIntyre. These recent thinkers were explicitly drawing on Aristotle, but in due course it was noticed that they might have reached similar conclusions if they'd been reading Kongzi and his followers. Before we can appreciate why Confucianism might count as a kind of virtue ethics, we obviously need to say something about what virtue ethics is. Fundamentally, it is a reorientation away from talk of moral duties and rules, an approach inspired especially by Immanuel Kant, and away from trying to maximize some kind of beneficial result, as in utilitarianism. Instead, the focus here is on moral character. A moral character is a settled disposition, a tendency to act a certain way across a variety of situations. Virtues are good states of moral character, while vices are bad ones. It's easy to think of examples. The virtues would include courage, justice, generosity, and honesty, while vices would include cowardice, injustice, greed, and dishonesty. A virtuous person is someone who knows how to behave in accordance with these character traits in any given circumstance, which can be a matter of fine judgment. The virtuous person also wants to behave the right way, so that, for instance, it would never occur to a generous person to be stingy, while a genuinely honest person would be agonized at having to lie. Indeed, the exercise of virtue makes the virtuous person happy, not just in the sense that they are subjectively satisfied with how things are going. That could be true of a vicious person who is indulging in vices, but in the sense that they are objectively flourishing as a human being. All these points may be found in Aristotle, and with a range of subtle modifications, in the modern-day virtue ethicists he has inspired. A common worry about virtue ethics is that it doesn't provide enough guidance about how to act, especially in hard cases where you face a moral dilemma. A Kantian would tell you to follow the moral law, and will be eager to tell you what that law dictates. A utilitarian would tell you to do whatever generates the most pleasure and least pain for the most people, and would have suggestions about how to do the calculation. In comparison, it seems less helpful to be told, just do whatever a virtuous person would do. To some extent, this objection is misplaced, at least when it comes to Aristotle himself. He presupposes that his audience already has a good grip on the right way to behave, which is why he says that the young are not ready to approach ethics as a philosophical topic. Their ethical intuitions are not yet fully formed. Aristotle doubts that one can give generally applicable and useful advice about ethical action, since situations vary so much. His task is instead to provide a systematic analysis of what virtue is, not to determine which particular actions are virtuous or vicious. One of the more famous elements of this analysis is his celebrated doctrine of the mean. The list of virtues and vices we just gave might have suggested that each virtue has an opposite: courage and cowardice, justice and injustice, and so on. But actually, Aristotle thinks that each virtue lies in the mean between two vices, as courage lies between cowardice and recklessness, or generosity between stinginess and profligacy. Likewise, injustice comes in two forms that lie on either side of justice. A judge might be too lenient or too harsh, whereas the right sentence would be just right. And here we come to our first remarkable parallel with Confucianism. As we've mentioned in previous episodes, one of the four works that later became a standard text in Confucian education was called the Doctrine of the Mean. The translation mean is a fair one, since the concept in Chinese is zongyong, which could literally be rendered as something like middle practice. It's an idea already found in the Analects itself. Here we are informed that Kongzi said that applying the mean is the best way to achieve virtue, and that overshooting the mark is just as bad as falling short of it. Descriptions of his own virtue emphasize his moderate approach, as in this passage, the master was affable yet firm, awe-inspiring without being severe, simultaneously respectful and relaxed. We also get concrete examples where a pair of opposing moral failures are said to lie on either side of the mean, as when Kongzi says, if you cannot manage to find a person of perfectly balanced conduct to associate with, I suppose you must settle for the wild or the fastidious. In their pursuit of the way, the wild plunge right in, while the fastidious are always careful not to get their hands dirty. Not that the middle path is said to be a discovery of Kongzi's. Like all his best ideas, it is traced back to still more antique sages. Yao told Shun to hold faithfully to the mean. We even find Confucian texts like the Mengzi comparing the hitting of the mean to accuracy in archery, an analogy also used by Aristotle. This is intriguing, but would not by itself be sufficient to qualify Kongzi as a virtue ethicist. What justifies that claim is really the focus that early Confucianism places on character and the individual virtues. Much as the Greeks spoke of the noble and good man, the kalos kagatos, who displays moral excellence, so Kongzi speaks of the junzi, a word often translated as gentleman. Like Greek talk of nobility, this term migrated from being more of a class distinction, the junzi was a man of good breeding and wealth, to being a moral paradigm for everyone to imitate. Thus, paradigmatic or exemplary person is a more appropriate translation of junzi. We'll be seeing in future episodes that as Confucianism developed, there emerged an intense debate as to whether virtue is in some sense natural to humans, or rather a correction and subdual of our inborn tendencies. But even for those who think that virtue builds on human nature rather than fighting it, it's clear that virtue requires a lengthy process of cultivation. The Confucian concern with moral cultivation seems to be comparable to the centrality of moral education and habituation in Aristotle. Admittedly, Kongzi did supposedly say, it is heaven itself that has endowed me with virtue. But for the most part, the Analects agrees with Aristotle in rejecting the idea that some people are just naturally virtuous. That Kongzi himself needed a long process of development is shown by his autobiographical remark, at 15 I set my mind upon learning, at 30 I took my place in society, at 40 I became free of doubts, at 50 I understood heaven's mandate, at 60 my ear was attuned, and at 70 I could follow my heart's desires without overstepping the bounds of propriety. As the last phase of that progression indicates, Confucians again agree with Aristotle in thinking that virtuous people desire to do what is good. Kant would tell you to act out of duty. If you also want to do the right thing, that's great, but it is not the properly moral reason for right action, and you can get full marks for being good against your inclination. Aristotle, by contrast, thinks that it is a sign of moral failing if you act well but would prefer not to. He identifies a type of character who meets this description, the person who is not virtuous, but merely strong-willed, as opposed to the weak-willed person who knows what should be done but can't bring themselves to do it. Imagine you are faced with a needy person and have some money in your pocket you were going to use to buy yourself a nice dinner. Kant will just tell you to help the needy person and that it is morally irrelevant whether you regret having to change your plans. For Aristotle, things are more complex. If you walk right on by, driven by gluttony, you are plain vicious. If you are instead weak-willed, you'll realize you should be charitable, but you'll avert your gaze and guiltily head off for that dinner nonetheless. If, on the other hand, you grit your teeth and fork over the money, wistfully reflecting on how tasty that dinner would have been, then you're strong-willed. But if you have real virtue, you'll gladly help out the needy person. You'd much rather exercise your generosity than eat even the most fabulous dinner. This is also how the Confucian junzi would react. As Kongzi says of acting rightly, or in accordance with Tao, one who knows it is not the equal of one who loves it, and one who loves it is not the equal of one who takes joy in it. He reflects on his own possible moral failings and says that he worries lest, upon hearing what is right, I remain unable to move myself to do it. So, there is both a cognitive and a motivational aspect to virtue, which is to say that the virtuous person needs both to be able to discern the right action and to choose it gladly. We can see this especially clearly with the most central virtue in classical Confucianism, namely ren. While the standard translation benevolence is a good one, It's worth noting that the term can also have the broader meaning of having all the virtues. In the narrow sense, though, ren means having concern for others, treating them in kind and compassionate ways. Here we should recall what we learned about filial piety, that one should show respect and care for one's parents not grudgingly, but out of sincere inner feeling. If all goes well, that feeling is inculcated in us during childhood and then blossoms into a more general benevolence for all our fellow humans. The virtue of ren encourages us to carry out appropriate actions towards everyone we meet, as we did toward our family members at an earlier stage of moral training. To act appropriately is, of course, what the Confucians call li, or ritual propriety. Thus, we can say that ren provides the motivation for li, while li offers a set of norms or guidelines for how to express ren. For the benevolent person, there is no clash between one's own self-interest and the interest of others, like the conflict between the desire for an opulent meal and the obligation to help a person in need. Instead, the person who has the deep-seated virtue of ren will take such delight in benevolence that they will spontaneously be generous. To act in just the same way, but without taking delight, is a sign of moral defect, if not depravity. While ren is an especially important virtue, there are others. Mengzi recognizes four especially central ones, what we might call cardinal virtues, namely ren, yi, li, and zi. We already know that ren is benevolence and li is ritual propriety. Yi is a similarly broad concept along the lines of righteousness or rightness. Philosopher Chung Kim Chung has defined it as doing what is right or proper as specified by li. More difficult to define is zi. It is often translated as wisdom, referring to a capacity to understand situations accurately so as to act appropriately. In any case, the idea of a canonical list of virtues is not really something we can find in the Analects. Instead, it offers various alternative lists, which is unsurprising, given what we have learned about the way that this text was put together. One of these lists itemizes 6 virtues that can lead to vice when they are not balanced out by learning. For example, loving courage, but not loving learning, will lead one to be unruly. This might be compared to Aristotle's warning against recklessness, the excess relative to courage, in contrast to the deficiency which is cowardice. You might remember that passage where Kongzi suggests that his disciple, Zilu, is the kind of man who would attack a tiger barehanded. Zilu might just be someone who loves courage more than he loves learning. Another item on this list is qin, which is sometimes considered Confucianism's 5th cardinal virtue. Qin may be translated as trust, trustworthiness, or honesty. Fundamentally, this virtue involves trustworthiness in speech, and especially in keeping one's word. Of course, honesty is important for maintaining good interpersonal relations, and it's also vital in the political context. The Analect says that good government prioritizes 3 things: food, weaponry, and the trust of the people, and that among these 3, trust is the one the government should be least willing to sacrifice. This is sound advice for governments. Of course, we expect them to care about people's material well-being and defense. But this statement in the Analects maintains that the people's trust in the government sits at the heart of good leadership. Thinking about trustworthiness as a virtue also reminds us that we should make promises very sparingly, and more generally, be slow to speak but quick to act. After all, the less you say, the easier it is to stay true to what you have said. On the other hand, like the other virtues, qin must be tempered by learning. When taken to extremes, it leads to a harmful rigidity. Here we have another application of the doctrine of the mean. Just as you can be insufficiently reliable, so you can be overly reliable if you adhere to your commitments when you shouldn't. As long as we're indulging in parallels to Greek philosophy, we might as well borrow an example from Plato. It would be wrong to fulfill a promise to return weapons to someone who has gone insane since lending them to you. Kongzi says that trustworthiness comes close to righteousness, but only close, presumably because one should be prepared to break one's word in very special circumstances. Thus, he classifies the person who insists on fulfilling his promises as narrow and rigid, and as only second best after the person of true virtue. How then are we to know when it is all right to break one's word or be untruthful? Like Aristotle, Kongzi has no general advice on this matter. This is another contrast to Kant, by the way, since he was rigid and narrow enough to say that lying always violates the moral law. Much like Aristotle's virtuous agent, the Confucian gentleman has a finely tuned moral sense that allows him to discern the line between appropriate trustworthiness and harmful rigidity. The need to avoid undue strictness is a running theme in the Analects. It may be the intent of a curious passage in which we learn that Kongzi did not sleep like a corpse or sit formally in an informal setting. And it is certainly the message behind the remark made by his student Zixia. As long as one does not transgress the bounds when it comes to important virtues, it is permissible to cross the line here and there when it comes to minor virtues. Again, though, being told to exercise latitude and avoid rigidity is not very helpful if we get no advice for deciding when and how. So Confucianism is apparently subject to the same complaint we saw with Aristotle, that it doesn't offer much of any guidance to making difficult moral decisions. But here too, this is a feature, not a bug. Both Aristotelian and Confucian ethics are sometimes said to be particularist, meaning that virtue just is, in part, the capacity to see what is called for in each particular circumstance. A virtuous person has to have such a capacity, since there are no general rules one can follow to be good. Any rule will be subject to exceptions, as we just saw with being truthful. Mengzi highlighted this when he said of Kongzi, he would take office or would remain in a state, would delay his departure or hasten it, all according to circumstance. Even the rules of ritual propriety only take us so far, because the perfect moral judge will know when to bend them and when to modify them, as we saw with the example of Kongzi accepting a change in the fabric used for making caps, while rejecting another change about bowing and ascending stairs. Another point we've touched on in the past, that filial piety is consistent with remonstrating with one's parents, would be another example. Here, the Confucian advice is to be gently critical, but only on occasion. It is part of true filial devotion to know when that occasion has arisen. Remarkably, even the recommendation to aim towards the mean apparently doesn't apply in all cases. Consider this passage from the Analects. When Yan Hui passed away, the master cried for him excessively. The disciples reproved him, saying, "Master, surely you are showing excessive grief." The master replied, "Am I showing excessive grief? Well, for whom would I show excessive grief if not for this man?" Even if Kongzi did gather himself in due course, this story shows us that in certain circumstances, overdoing it can be just right. In a discussion of Kongzi's apparently uncharacteristic grief, Amy Olberding has used the same comparison we ourselves have made between virtue and musical skill. She points out that the expert may occasionally throw in an infelicity, something that would count as a mistake if committed by a less advanced performer, but adds to the overall aesthetic effect. One might wonder how, if at all, this sort of thing can be taught, much as we were just asking what kind of guidance, if any, Confucians or other particularists can offer in the moral sphere. The musical analogy suggests an answer. Just as becoming a master at music or any other craft requires training under a master artist, we become virtuous not by internalizing rules, but by emulating people who are already virtuous. So, when we are in a difficult spot, instead of asking ourselves what rule to apply or what would produce the best overall results, we should ask ourselves a question like, what would Kongzi do? Better still, we should think of a virtuous person we've had the fortune to know personally, because we are likely to have a sense of how they might act in this circumstance. Of course, the advice is not simply to impersonate them mechanically, trying to walk their walk and talk their talk. We do learn a lot in the Analects about Kongzi's everyday comportment, not just how he walked and talked, but how he ate, and as we just saw, even how he slept. But if we imitate these easily observed outward behaviors, it is only as a step towards emulating his inner virtue. The focus of emulation is a virtuous person's character, such as their genuine concern for other people's well-being, rather than specific actions they have undertaken. As we saw in a previous episode, scholars have called this aspect of a person's character their style. A person's style is what makes them who they are. It is what defines them. The style of a generous person is expressed in their interactions with others. It's not so much what they do, but how they engage with others, giving of their time to support others, listening closely to what they say, helping out as appropriate when they can. The powerful effects of emulation can help to explain what at first seems to be a rather bizarre feature of the Confucians' philosophy, namely their faith that merely by setting a good example, one can transform the ethical character of others and even society as a whole. The most extreme example may be this one from the Analects. The master said, "Is Shun not an example of someone who ruled by means of Wu Wei? What did he do? He made himself reverent and took his proper ritual position facing south. That is all." Though many of us will have had the urge to tell our political leaders to sit down and shut up, this probably isn't what we had in mind. Kongzi seems here to be imagining that exemplary individuals can exert an almost magical effect on their environment, so that they do not need to do anything to make everyone else fall in line. Hence his use of the term wu wei, meaning non action. We saw in the very first episode of this series that this concept is especially associated with Taoism, but as the passage shows, it also turns up in the Confucian classics. To understand how it functions here, we may recall that, according to Mengzi, this very same sage, the ruler, Shun, converted his own father to virtue simply by being virtuous himself. As a result, Mengzi adds, all the fathers and sons in the world were established in their relationships. In fact, there is nothing magical going on here. The idea is that when people are exposed to great virtue, they become more virtuous themselves. The second book of the Analects begins by comparing the virtuous ruler to the pole star. It simply remains in its place and receives the homage of the myriad lesser stars. A statement which comes just after is even more explicit. If you try to guide the common people with coercive regulations and keep them in line with punishments, the common people will become evasive and will have no sense of shame. If, however, you guide them with virtue and keep them in line by means of ritual, the people will have a sense of shame and will rectify themselves. As Olberding explained, the Confucians even had a specific term, de, for this ability to attract and inspire others, to influence them without coercion, to follow the model the good person offers. While the whole idea sounds rather idealistic, it is in part based on a rather cynical assumption, namely that most people are very easy to influence. The Analects compares the virtuous person to wind, and the common folk to grass, which simply bends with the wind. Insofar as people are often swayed by the actions and behaviors of those around them, perhaps they really are like the grass that will bend when the wind blows over it. Just think of the influencers to whom businesses are paying huge sums precisely because the influencers are effective in promoting sales. Nevertheless, we should distinguish between this simplistic bending of the commoners and the sort of cultivated excellence achieved through concerted, lifelong emulation of an exemplary sage. Only that kind of intensive and intimate modeling is going to bring moral learners to the level where they can exercise their own discretion, reliably judging what would be right to do in each situation and instinctively desiring to do it. With this topic of emulation, we've already begun to see that Confucianism is not just Chinese Aristotelianism. The notion of emulation is not entirely absent in Aristotle. It can be detected in his remarks on the friendship between virtuous people. But for him, moral learning is primarily a matter of habituation, which happens not by finding role models to imitate, but by repeatedly performing actions of the right kind. And this is only one of many contrasts we can draw. While Aristotle did see a close connection between ethics and political philosophy, he distinguished the two topics and even dedicated separate treatises to them. It would be harder, perhaps impossible, to disentangle private virtue from public governance in Confucianism. This is shown by the case of the ruler, Shun, and the fact that, as we saw, Kongzi was still said to be participating in government just by being a good son and brother. Furthermore, Aristotle devotes a significant portion of his Nicomachean Ethics to exploring theoretical virtue as opposed to practical virtue. There is no such distinction in the Analects, and again, there is good reason for thinking that there couldn't be, since the sort of knowledge that interests Kongzi is invariably bound up with moral concerns. Another, somewhat more technical point is that for Aristotle, you cannot have just some of the virtues. To have any of them, you must have them all. Kongzi does not accept this thesis of the unity of the virtues. To the contrary, he cautions against the consequences of being courageous while lacking other virtuous traits, and says that courage does not imply goodness. Of course, these divergences between Aristotle and Kongzi do not prove that Confucianism is not virtue ethics. It just shows that it is a different kind of virtue ethics, and of course, all the more interesting for it. But a different objection would undermine the whole interpretation. As we saw in episode 9, some scholars see in this tradition a distinctive ethical paradigm that is not present in European philosophy, which they call role ethics. The leading proponents of this reading, Rosemont and Ames, explicitly contrast Confucian role ethics to virtue ethics, on the grounds that virtue ethics, as we find it in Aristotle, is concerned mostly with the autonomous individual, not with persons who get their identity through relationships to others. If this is right, then the many similarities between Confucianism and Aristotelianism would mask a more profound disagreement. But it is not clear that role ethics and virtue ethics are mutually exclusive. Aristotle, too, thinks that a life of virtue involves excellence in interpersonal relationships and social roles. This is especially clear from his extensive discussion of friendship, but also from his treatment of such virtues as generosity and his own consideration of family life. This is not to deny that Aristotle does recognize virtues that are displayed by individuals on their own, for instance, temperance in respect of food and drink. But it is to suggest that what Rosemont and Ames identify as role ethics could fall under the broader heading of virtue ethics. Ethical attainments like filial piety, which we display by carrying out our social roles in the right way, are stable character traits acquired through moral cultivation, with inbuilt motivation and skill in making particular judgments. They are, in short, virtues. With that, we have finally finished our investigation of the Analects, the foundational text of the Confucian tradition. That doesn't mean, though, that we've finished with Confucianism. Though we've mentioned him numerous times in this and earlier episodes, we haven't yet taken a close look at Mengzi, author of the next great classical text of the tradition. So that's what we'll do next time, as we continue to do what the Analects recommends by learning from the best, here on The History of Philosophy in China.